Chilton book that's coming out next year.
2012, hopefully, yes.
Okay. You gotta get on that.
I've got to finish it, so.
Not that you have anything else to do. Is there anything that surprised you so far when you've been writing?
With the Alex book? Oh, it's been very interesting because I actually knew Alex going back to '82, and you know, back in the '80s when I played in bands, he actually produced one of my bands. We did a little EP recording in '85, and he produced it. And so, and I'd interviewed him myself a couple of times, but it's been interesting just to find out about his background, things that happened to him as a kid that I had no idea about, because he was a very conversational kind of guy, and I had a lot of long talks with him, but it was usually about music and books and world events and things like that. So it's been fascinating to find out what his life was really like growing up in Memphis and later in New Orleans, and just incredible stories from some of his musical colleagues and friends. And also, just even doing the research for the book proposal, I discovered how, you know, he really was such an integral part of music history. Even, you know, people were like, how, Gene Autry, Alex Chilton, but in a way they both were kind of ahead of the curve in changes in the entertainment industry, and Alex was definitely like that. I mean, you know, he was on the Box Tops, kind of a put-together group, kind of, you know, the last of those kind of put-together groups in the 60s, which we still see today with, you know, we've seen with the boy bands and things like that. And then he was, you know, one of those kind of visionary artists with Big Star in the 70s that didn't care what was popular at the time, but really had this vision and pursued making very personal albums to show the, you know, what they were thinking about and the kind of music they were listening to. It didn't matter that, you know, prog rock and big music was coming out at that time. So that was, you know, really set the scene for what we have with the whole indie rock scene that started happening in the 80s, and so many acolytes from, you know, R.E.M., Replacements, all these bands. And then he was actually one of the first artists to start wanting to do records his own way as a solo artist, putting them out himself, just licensing the recordings, but owning the masters, and which is now very commonplace. But he was one of the first artists to really do that. So, and he was also one of the first rock and roll type artists who started looking back to, you know, jazz and pop standards and covering those kind of chestnuts, which now, you know, you've got every, you know, Rod Stewart and all these people doing it, but Alex started doing that back in the 80s before anybody else. So.
Wow. As I listen to you talk about your books and the subjects of your books, I think you're a bit of a historian as well. Do you see yourself that way?
Yeah, I've always been a bit of a history nut, and of course to me music history really, not only things that have happened in music have changed our culture, but also reflects our culture. So especially, but I think with music in particular, you can see so many changes in the music in our society thanks to the music, and they kind of go hand in hand. So yeah, I'm fascinated by that kind of thing.
You have a real loving way of presenting people to us as well. There's a real personal touch in your writing and in your books.
Yeah, well, I you know, for the most part, most of my, especially my books, I really care about the subjects that I'm writing about, and I really want to give them their due, and I really want to go as in depth as I possibly can, you know, so that it's not some kind of just fluff type piece, you know, and really try to get to the heart and soul of what the, you know, of the subject and the subject's life and musical contributions as much as I can, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And you actually brought some of your books here, and I love this one, Punk 365. So as you're putting a book together like this, Holly, are you kind of thinking of a narrative as well?
Well, you know, luckily I was a huge punk rock fan. That's kind of what brought me to New York. So I kind of had a general idea of the structure of the book, but as I started calling photographers and having them send me their work and looking at the visuals and then doing, you know, my usual crazy research to go along with the text, you know, for the text to go along with the photos, I started kind of figuring out in my mind how to structure the book. And these 365 series, which Abrams has done quite a few cool subjects books, you know, there's so many pictures and, you know, and so many pages. It's, you know, 720 something pages. Wow. So as I was going through, I just kind of started figuring out the pacing of the book through the visuals, but also through the historical chronology. So, you know, it was kind of like had a journal idea, but I'm always open to change. And same thing even with writing the Alex book. You know, as I learn more, I'm like, oh, okay, so things might change from what I originally thought it was as I learn more information. The punk book was really fun for me to do because I did this book right on the heels of finishing the Gene Autry book.
Wow.
So after steeping myself in, you know, the 20s and 30s, and I mean actually going back even further because he was born in 1907, so it was really refreshing to do a book like, this is my time after having spent the past few years focusing on a period that I, you know, never witnessed or lived through myself, which was Gene Autry's time. I felt a lot more ease about it. It was a lot of fun and just the energy of the photos. But again, even just the music that I was listening to, and I like to listen to music when I write, so I was listening to all the punk music and stuff as I was looking through the pictures. And, you know, there is, you know, a thread between Gene Autry, some of his music, and punk rock, so that was fun. Yeah.
If nothing else, just that grassroots element of it, that DIY aspect of it.
Yeah, and for the punk book, I really tried to find some photos, too, that had not been widely seen, along with, you know, wanted to use some of the iconic ones that people knew about, some of the famous, you know, Bob Gruen shots and things like that, but I also wanted to find some that you didn't see that often, so I tried to seek out some lesser-known photographers.
Very cool. And The Road to Woodstock you actually co-wrote with Michael Lang, and this is coming out in paperback later this year?
Yeah, it actually just came out in paperback very recently, yeah, and this was a real fun project, and I'm like, oh yeah, I guess now I'm specializing in, you know, punk rockers, cowboys, hillbillies, now hippies. And funnily, right before I did The Road to Woodstock, I did another 365 book on the Grateful Dead, which,
it's a great cover,
you know, yeah, the art director really had some fun with the cover on this book. And I don't know if you've noticed, but you can, the page is there, depending on how you do it, it says, you know, Deadhead. So
that's cool.
Yeah.
I actually have the same birthday as Jerry Garcia.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Well, and I had done a book on Jerry Garcia when I was at Rolling Stone when he tragically died back in the 90s. So I had some background information, and I, you know, went through my Dead phase in the 70s, so I had a bit of information. And weirdly, you know, Grateful Dead, those guys were big fans of Gene Autry and the singing cowboys and hillbilly music, and actually covered some of those songs. So again, there was a tie-in, but doing the work on that book and putting those photos together was a nice little head, you know, trip to get into the Michael Lang book, because of course the Dead played at Woodstock, and you know, I kind of grew up a wannabe hippie in the small town of North Carolina, you know, in the 60s. So it was a lot of fun for me to work with Michael Lang and really actually to find out the prequel to Woodstock, which was very fascinating, all the stuff that happened leading up to the festival. And then also really, you know, I found out that, you know, most of my knowledge about Woodstock was based on seeing the movie, and the movie really does not at all depict the way the festival really did unfold. I mean, the bands are out of order, and you know, it was made as a movie. So I think it captured the feel of the festival, but as far as like historical information, you know, it's definitely not accurate to understand what really happened in the festival. So that was a lot of fun working on the book with Michael and getting the behind the scenes real story.
Yeah, it's very, very cool book. And so I guess what you're saying is Gene Autry is the Kevin Bacon of music.
That's right. Yay, Gene.
You're only 6 degrees and you can lead yourself right to Gene Autry. Before we go, I want to ask you one question and kind of touch back on your museum work and maybe being a historian. What would be in the Holly George Warren Museum?
Oh my gosh, oh, that would be a frightening, I kind of, you can ask my husband and my son, and they might say,
is he ready to load the truck right now?
Well, we kind of already live in a Holly George Warren Museum, sadly for them, but I don't think, they are very good to me and don't give me too much of a hard time about all my stuff. I guess it would be all kinds of vintage, you know, vintage records, vintage clothing. I am a bit of a pack rat. I still have ticket stubs from my first concerts that I saw. You know, I think my first ever concert was the Jackson 5 at the Greensboro Coliseum. It was either 69 or 70, and I still have the original program from that. So I guess it would be all my memorabilia and artifacts from my intersection with rock and roll and country and things like that, Western stuff, you know.
a little Western stuff.
Yeah.
It was fun to talk with you. Thank you for sharing everything with us. Thank you for bringing these books and sharing them with us here on our first Rock Book Show road trip.
Yay.
And this has really been fun. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Well, thanks for having me on the show, and good luck to the Rock Book Show. I think it's a fabulous idea.